Welcome back to the program. If you're just joining us, this is a special edition of Bottomline Africa. We're focusing on Zimbabwe. Now, the world's oldest leader, Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe, celebrated his 93rd birthday this year in what critics described as obscene and lavish birthday party in a country is accused of plunging into poverty. Mugabe led the country for 37 years and was poised to seek another time in next year's election. Our Foreign Affairs editor, Lilian Odera, with the life and times of Uncle Bob, as it's commonly referred to.
What could turn out to be the 93-year-old leader's final night in charge of the troubled South African nation concluded in typically chaotic fashion, with the army saying it had Mugabe and his ambitious wife Grace in custody, following a takeover of the state broadcaster.
Good morning, Zimbabwe. Fellow Zimbabweans, following the address we made on 13 November 2017, which we believe our main broadcaster, Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation, and the Herald were directed not to publicize, the situation in our country has moved to another level. Firstly, we wish to assure the nation that His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe and Commander-in-Chief of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, Comrade R.G. Mugabe, and his family are safe and sound, and their security is guaranteed.
Tensions escalated after the First Lady appeared to be positioned to replace Mugabe's recently fired deputy, Emmerson Mnangagwa, leading many in Zimbabwe to suspect she could eventually succeed her husband. Grace, Mugabe's second wife, after Sarah Heffron died in 1992, remained unpopular with some Zimbabweans because of her lavish spending, including in London's plush stores, while many around her struggled against the country's crippling economy. Mugabe's savage rule over Zimbabwe was dominated by murder, bloodshed, torture, persecution of political opponents, intimidation, and vote rigging on a grand scale.
Amount of Western pressure to step down and to reverse some of his policies, and he's done neither.
Mugabe came to power in 1980, a hero of the fight against white minority rule, and the country became known for good education and health. He was the man who in 1980 became the head of government of Zimbabwe, chosen to guide the country towards democracy after 14 years of rebellion against the crown, headed by the white Southern Rhodesian leader Ian Smith. Robert Gabriel Mugabe was born on February 24, 1924, in Kutama. He was educated at Kutama Mission School and Fort Hare University and obtained degrees in correspondence courses with other educational establishments, including London University. He worked as a teacher at various schools.
Of course, the development there in Zimbabwe forms the basis of our discussion tonight. Many thanks, Lilian, for that comprehensive report on Uncle Bob, as is commonly referred, that is Robert Mugabe, the oldest president in the world. Now, Alex Magaisa is a United Kingdom-based Zimbabwean academic and lecturer of law at the Kent Law School of the University of Kent. He served as the advisor of the then Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, Morgan Tsvangirai, from the year 2012 to the year 2013. Another guest we have in studio is Abel Oyeyo, researcher at the Center for African Progress. We also have Mark Bichachi, a resident political analyst. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to the show. So, Mark, let me begin with Alex, because there's the Zimbabwean here. And Alex, good evening. We've seen General Sibuse Moyo saying we are targeting criminals. Of course, as he's saying we, that is the military. And we've seen military has taken control, but they're denying that it's a coup. They've also taken over the country's radio, the country's television. These are all ingredients of a coup. Why are they not saying it openly? Alex, can you hear me? Okay, as we sort with Alex there about his voice, let me pose that question to you, Mark, once again. Why is the military in Zimbabwe not saying openly that whatever is happening in Zimbabwe is a military coup?
For the question. And we need to remember one of the nicknames of Uncle Bob before he was called Uncle Bob. He was called Comrade Bob. Now, the reason he was called Comrade Bob is in the struggle in the Southern African countries. He was he had some form of support towards South Africa and Namibia. Now, these neighbors of Zimbabwe have always supported the Mugabe regime silently and overtly, and therefore for them, if you're going to hold a coup against Mugabe, you've got to look at the external pressure in the region that you have around you, remembering that the Zimbabwean army is not as strong as its neighbors. That being said, it is also key to remember that coups are not popular on this side of history. I think after the 2000s, there's never been a time where the world has applauded a coup. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to mask their coup into a peaceful handover between Mugabe and his then estranged vice president Managangwa, who's just jetted back from South Africa. So what they're trying to do is to try and create a civilian process using military coercion. That is what they're trying to do.
I think this is something that so many observers are describing it as a unique kind of coup. Now, Abel, do you agree with Mark that the reason as to why the military in Zimbabwe doesn't want to pronounce whatever is happening in Zimbabwe as a coup is because they're afraid of backlash, perhaps in the international community?
Well, I think my view is a bit different because I agree with the military, it's not a coup. When you assess the histories of all the guys in the military and even in government, they seem to come from the same age group. Guys who participated in the fight against the white minority rule, and they've come a long way with Mugabe. So what they've done is actually to push away Grace and create space for someone else to come in, which is, of course, the former vice president. So what they don't want to do is to create space for Grace to become president and instead give Mugabe what we call a soft landing as they bring in someone else. I don't think it's a coup.
But Abel, when the military comes in, gets out the current president and replaces him with another individual who has been fired apparently by the same president, what can you call that if it's not a coup?
I think that they've just intervened to create the kind of atmosphere that is conducive for a peaceful transfer of power in a chaotic kind of atmosphere. Now, there was a lot of discontent after the vice president, of course, was kicked out.
Mark, are you seeing a situation where Mugabe has become too old? Of course, he's 93 right now, that he cannot comprehend the current situation. We're seeing the military taking over. They're not saying it's a coup. What is exactly happening?
Yusuf, we know we've said on this show before that the Southern Africans need to be delivered from their deliverers. They need to be set free from their freedom fighters. And this has been the problem for a long time. I said on this show before that Robert Mugabe is still in the bush and is still fighting the white man. That is his dream, and it is an old man's dream because old men live in the past. Now, what was supposed to happen in his wife's brain was what Bathsheba did in putting Solomon on the throne of David when David was old and almost gone. But she forgot that you need to put someone else, not yourself. And she also forgot that her popularity all the way from the 2000s, when she would book an entire mall in South Africa just so she could shop for herself and book an entire flight, a Boeing flight all the way to South Africa just so she could shop for herself when there was no food in the shelves of Harare. The Zimbabweans have not forgotten that. But the other thing that Comrade Bob had forgotten, that he had stayed in power despite his unpopular moves, his economic downturn, simply because he had the support of what used to be known as ZIPRA or ZAPU in the past. Now, his deputy president comes from that faction of Zanu-PF, and that was the military faction. That means he had connections to the army. So whereas Comrade Bob was able to put the Morgan Tsvangirais at bay, he forgot forgot that the power he'd used to keep them at bay were the soldiers he fought with.
Yes.
Now, when you cross the people who keep you in power, it is like me deciding to have an argument with the legs of this chair. I shall surely fall.
And speaking about Morgan Changirai, we have his former advisor with us, Alex Magaisa, is now joining us via phone link. Alex, good evening. How would you best describe the current situation in Zimbabwe? Even as the military there says, it's not a military coup.
Well, thank you for inviting me. The situation in Zimbabwe, obviously, the military is insisting that they have not carried out a coup, but everything that they've done, the actions speak louder than words. They indicate that the military has effectively taken over. Mr. Mugabe is currently under house arrest. He's confined to his house. That kind of situation cannot be described as anything other than a coup.
Alex, I think you've delivered your point. Now, another question. The military are saying that, the reason as to why they've come into this situation is that they feel like the current leadership in Zanu-PF is not proper. And observers are saying likelihood is that the deputy president might take over, is also a member of the Zanu-PF. Where will this leave the opposition in Zimbabwe?
Well, I mean, look, this is just a fight between two brothers in the same household. There is no difference between the two factions of Zanu-PF. The question about the opposition remains as it was yesterday. It is still the same issue. The opposition's problem is not that they are unable. The opposition's problem is that they have been thwarted by this system. Mugabe has survived for so long because of this system which is backed by the military. These are the same people who have taken over. So the opposition is literally in the same position that it was at the beginning. There's no difference.
Yes.
They're fighting the same system.
Yeah, let me engage Mark now. Mark, as much as you've said this is some sort of a peaceful transition of power, are we seeing a situation where there's some sort of an implosion within the ruling ZANU-PF party?
Absolutely. It's got all the hallmarks of a self-imploding mechanism, simply because, let's remember, every leader stands on the shoulders of giants. Now, the one thing you need to learn about leadership is you do not break the back of the person you're standing on top of. And that's what he did when he fired Nagangwa. So this is definitely, as our brother from Zimbabwe has said, this is a brother fight. But remember, what has just happened is the legs upon which Mugabe stood have been taken away. So the reality of the matter is this is a sibling fight indeed, but the younger sibling who's much stronger than the older 93-year-old sibling seems to have won this match. And I don't think Mugabe has a comeback to this one.
Abel, do you think Mugabe should have left power maybe long time ago?
Well, I actually think so. Mugabe was supposed to quit power, I think, when he turned 80. But unfortunately, that is not a trend that is common in African countries.
Yes.
Our leaders tend to cling to power until they get to 100 years old. Now, it's quite unfortunate for the people of Zimbabwe because what has happened is not anything new. It's not a transition of power to something that is new because the president, that is Emerson Mnangagwa, is 75 years old. And all the other guys in the military between their 65th and maybe 75th birthday. So it's not like Zimbabweans are going to be given something that is going to be refreshing or even maybe strengthening in any particular, aspect. So it's a transfer of power within the same kind of mindset that is going to actually keep the Zimbabweans under intense oppression in terms of politics, in terms of economics. So, and like you've pointed out, the opposition has been left out totally, which again is unfortunate because Morgan himself comes from the same school of thought. He was actually part of the Mugabe party before he quit, of course, to form the movement for democratic change. So Zimbabweans find themselves in a very unfortunate corner in terms of, the kind of transition we need to see from dictatorships to democracies. So nothing new is happening in Zimbabwe. It's just a power that is being kept within the same circle.
And probably we might see the next leader coming from the ZANU-PF party.
Definitely.
Now, Alex, if you're still with me, there are those who believe that or say that, the wheels of ZANU-PF came off back in the year 2014 when Joyce Mujuru was fired and she was succeeded by Mnangagwa. He was also fired. What is the future of ZANU-PF like with this development now happening in Zimbabwe?
Well, one way to look at the fight that's been taking place in Zanu-PF is that it's a fight between generations. On the one hand, there is the liberation generation, which includes those people who were fighters during the War of Liberation in the 1970s. And then there is a generation of younger people who have no connection or limited connection to the liberation struggle. And what has happened is that with the Mujuru faction, they were sent away, expelled from Zanu-PF in 2014. That was part of what is called the G40, Generation 40, as efforts to kick away the part of the liberation generation. They used some of the liberation generation to achieve that objective. But of course, immediately after Grace Mugabe was fired, they started an assault on the remaining members of the liberation generation. That includes the former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa, which led to his firing last week. And of course, that became the last straw for the liberation generation, who are still key members of the military forces. And that's why you see the military forces
coming Alex.
in order to defend the liberation generation.
Yes, well said, Alex. And Mark, Alex here is in Zimbabwe. He's seeing all this development as a military coup. We normally, of course, military coups are normally witnessed in most parts of Western Africa. But what does this mean for Zimbabwe moving forward? Are we going to foresee, or are you foreseeing a situation where Zimbabwe will be yet another country that will be highly militarized?
I would say not. It's already highly militarized. Zimbabwe is a police state. Let's start there. So it can't really get much worse than that, because unlike other countries which descend into civil war, a lot of civilians do not have access to arms. And that being said, I think the situation for Zimbabwe might not be as bleak as we may want to imagine. Number one, let's remember the adage that a change is as good as a rest. That tells you there will be fresh hope with a fresh president, no matter whether he believes in Mugabe kind of politics or he's a progressive leader. That change will give a sigh of relief to a nation that has been highly oppressed. However, let's also remember that the people who've effectively been kicked out, that is Grace Mugabe and her ilk, are going to form what will be known as an opposition, whether within country or in exile. There'll be a dissenting voice to the powers that be. And her power is not small. And let's not forget that Morgan is not in the dustbin of history yet. So I think the political space may not change, but the players may increase.
Yes, Alex, before I come to you, Abel, Alex, let's talk about Grace Mugabe, the wife of the old man, and she's been described as Delilah from the Bible. Do you think that title befits her, by the way?
Well, I think that is very true given the kind of lifestyle she's led as a first lady. And it is unfortunate because she was not able to control herself. Now, when you look at her background, I don't think she's gone beyond the kind of space you'd give someone of a, educational and maybe social background. She was the president's secretary, so she was not exposed to the kind of power she got access to once she became the first lady. And it was expected because Mugabe was getting very weak and she had access to the Mzee. So she began plotting. Instead of power moving from Mugabe to someone else, she felt like, she can come in and be president. So she made a mistake for being overambitious. And of course, she was not able to reach out to the Zimbabweans in a way that could have made her, a darling of the people. I think it could have been much easier to actually convince Zimbabweans to support her if she had a charitable kind of personality which could have made her, likable.
Allow me to listen to this from Alex. Alex, as a Zimbabwean, how can you describe Grace Mugabe, the wife of Robert Mugabe? Because they're also saying that the reason behind Mugabe making so many unpopular decisions is because she was the one advising him.
Well, you know what? Grace Mugabe has got many faults. Her kind of politics, her brand of politics has been very aggressive. She has been very rude. She likes to humiliate adults very publicly. And she has given a brand of politics that's very repulsive. However, I would like to note a word of caution here, which is I often hear many comments about Grace being blamed for Mugabe's behavior. which seems to suggest that Mugabe himself lacks agency. Look, Mugabe is a man. Mugabe is a patriarch. Mugabe, he was a president before Grace Mugabe came onto the scene. He was already bad before Grace was on the scene. This idea of blaming Grace Mugabe for Mugabe's behavior, I think in a way it's actually misogynistic in some ways. An effort to blame a woman for the faults of a man. Mugabe was always bad. That's what people don't know. We listen to narratives that tell us that Mugabe used to be a good man. Go to Machiavellian in Zimbabwe, and they'll never tell you that Mugabe used to be a good man, because they witnessed the massacre in the 1980s. So this idea that Grace Mugabe is to blame for Mugabe, it has to be approached with extreme caution.
Yes, Alex, very briefly, with the current situation in Zimbabwe, do you think there's any likelihood for that country to conduct next year's poll with the current situation in mind?
I think it's very difficult. My own feeling is that the election may be postponed in order to carry out the necessary reforms that are required to hold a free and fair election. But remember, the most important thing for Zimbabwe is to get the economy going, and therefore I see perhaps a transitional authority being set up in order to achieve that objective.
Yes. Now, Mark, this is a question I asked Abel earlier. From your own observation, from your own experience, do you think Mugabe should have left power a long time ago, because he has achieved a lot, as much as people would like to criticize him as well?
Well, Mugabe should have done what Mandela did, and Mandela understood a simple thing that a lot of people need to understand. You cannot be a freedom fighter and a leader outside the fight. That transition is very, very difficult. It's been difficult for Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. It's proving possibly difficult for Kagame in Rwanda. It proved very difficult for Kabila and his son in the Congo, and that's the reality of these matters. Mugabe should have stepped down a long time ago, and actually, let's mention here that, and I cannot say the people who've given me this information, but I know from good authority that people in Zimbabwe are celebrating. Now, the question is, what are they celebrating? You see, it is not just the removal of the autocracy, but it is also the removal of the autocrat, the despot, who has sat on the people of Zimbabwe for a very long time. And they're definitely just waiting for him to say that he's stepped down. The struggle after that will continue. And Mugabe should have stepped down. Definitely, it's a good thing he's stepping down. Now, what is going to be critical, though, is to manage the transition. And whereas they might want to postpone the election, my advice to them would be to do the election as quickly as possible and return to a semblance of democracy as quickly as possible.
Abel, we have Musevenis of this world. We have the Nasibe dynasty in Togo. There are demonstrations going on in Togo almost on a daily basis. Do you think with the development in Zimbabwe, this might serve as a wake-up call to the rest of the continent?
Well, I think to some extent when something like this happens in a particular place, there is what we call motivation for the same forces in other places. For example, you know what happened in Gambia, emboldened so many progressive forces across the continent, and you know, we saw what was happening in places like Cameroon and all that. But again, I'd like to go back a little bit to the assumption we've always made about elections in Zimbabwe. Now, Zimbabwe comes from a tribe called the Shona, which constitutes 70% of the population. Now, like Kenya, Zimbabwe suffers from a serious problem of tribalism, and it's always about going to vote for your person. The company that I work for, that is the Center for African Progress, sent guys to Zimbabwe. They did some research, and there is some pocket of the population that is very, very much contented with Mugabe. So when we say there's maybe excitement, it's not widespread in the entire country. There are places where allegiance to Mugabe is still very high. And that is why the members of the armed forces were not quick to come out and say it's a coup. They actually had to tell them it is some kind of intervention meant to keep peace.
Actually, they went ahead and said Mugabe and his family are safe. Now, Alex, one final question for you. South Africa, they're seen as a big brother when it comes to the south of the continent. Jacob Zuma is on record, having said that he has sent an envoy there to make sure that these two sides come to the same table and talk. But it's something that some Zimbabweans are not taking it lightly. Alex, why is that the case?
Well, the intervention of the SADC region of South Africa in this case is intended to try and create an atmosphere of negotiation between Mr. Mugabe on the one hand and the generals on the other hand. I do think that it is important to find a solution to the impasse, and it is possible that South Africa might help. But the reason why people are ambivalent about South Africa is, of course, its role in previous mediation efforts when it tended to favor Mr. Mugabe, helping him to stay in power. That's the impression, at least, that was created by Mr. Mbeki's role in that mediation in 2008. And so people do have questions about that.
Mark, do you think South Africa, a big brother to Zimbabwe then the South, have failed in making sure, that things are under control in Zimbabwe? Have they given Zimbabwe some sort of a deaf ear?
To look at the relationship between South Africa and Zimbabwe without looking at the personal connectedness between Zanu-PF and the ANC and their struggle against apartheid and white oppression in the past would immediately make a mistake in terms of assessing this situation. Make no mistake, the powers that be in South Africa have always supported Mugabe. If South Africa did not support the economy of Zimbabwe, Mugabe would have been deposed a long time ago. Mm-hmm. So the reality of the matter, anyone being sent from South Africa into Zimbabwe will be seen as someone who's pushing the agenda of South Africa. Now, this, I think, is a moment for Zimbabwe to settle it themselves. I don't think they've killed anyone. There is no crisis per se in terms of any form of war. And as they say, cometh the hour, cometh the man. This is the opportunity for Zimbabweans to rise up, a son of Zimbabwe who's able to stand and depose Mugabe, but still be able to lead the country how Mandela led it, to a peaceful transition of power from one president to the next. That is going to be the most important thing.
And Abel, speaking about Mugabe's legacy, there are those who say that, that his Zanu-PF party, that is the ruling party, will still rule because the military, apparently, from, unconfirmed reports, they might bring on board the fired Deputy President Mnangagwa to power. So, I mean, do you think there's any opposition figure in Zimbabwe who might go ahead and challenge Zanu-PF properly?
Well, I don't think so, because as we speak now, the opposition leader, that is Morgan, is sick. He's suffering from cancer. So he's been making so many trips to South Africa for treatment. Mm-hmm. And he's being challenged from within his party to relinquish power to younger, politicians like Nelson Chamisa. So for a long time, I think there is likely to be some kind of void in terms of opposition. And there's a semblance of euphoria that has been created by the change of course, of guard. And there's likely to be a lot of support for Emmerson Mnangagwa as he goes for the presidency, of course. That is if there's an election to be held in 2018. So for a stretch of time, we're not likely to see serious opposition to Zanu-PF, which is unfortunate.
Alex, Abel says maybe in the near future there might be no serious competitors from the opposition, challenging Zanu-PF. Do you think that is the case?
Well, I think that slightly exaggerated, because at the moment, for the past 3 years, Zanu-PF has obviously hogged the limelight, and therefore people tend to get the impression that there is nothing going on in the opposition. I think it's true that a lot of Zimbabweans are frustrated by the opposition, but they are more frustrated by the fact that they were unable to see an avenue of dislodging Zanu-PF from power after even defeating them in elections in 2008, but being unable to take power. And that was the biggest problem. The biggest problem is not so much that the opposition is weak, but that the system that sustains Zanu-PF has almost appeared to be impregnable. The opportunity that people are looking at now is that now that Mugabe is gone, are there any channels that have been opened by this particular move? Some people are hopeful, and others are saying, look, the system is still the same. Unless that system changes, we are still going to face the same problem. So to that extent, yes, there is a challenge for the opposition, and it continues to mount. In fact, I believe that the opposition is going to be facing a bigger challenge with the Mnangagwa and the Chiwengas, the military guys in power, because they are unlikely to yield, and they will use the gun in the event that they lose elections.
Yes. Now, Mark, UK's Prime Minister Theresa May says that, both sides should show restraint in Zimbabwe, and said the situation in the country still remains fluid. Then Boris Johnson says Zimbabweans should be careful that they should not come up with another Mugabe. What does that mean? And what are you reading in this? Does it mean that the UK does not trust Mnangagwa as well?
Of course, the UK would not trust Mnangagwa, because let's remember his history with Zimbabwe. Mnangagwa himself, he fought in the trenches with Mugabe. He's been in command in the army for a very long time. He has been part of the machine that actually kicked out the Western farmers who were mostly from Britain. So definitely the amount of trust on Mnangagwa is very thin. But I don't think this is a moment where the West needs to be telling the people of Zimbabwe what they need to do. Because the truth of the matter is this, that the Zimbabweans want change. The Zimbabweans want the economy to move forward. And indeed, why Mugabe's policy for reclaiming land was popular is he reclaimed land on behalf of veterans. That was his premise. Now that he's crossed the veterans and the veterans are standing up, our hope is not that Mnangagwa is like Mugabe or not. The hope is that Zimbabwe will rise again. That the beauty of the land of Zimbabwe will be the beauty of the economy of Zimbabwe. It will be the beauty of and the pearl of Africa again. That is the hope, regardless of who does it.
Yes. Alex, you have 30 seconds. Your final comment moving forward with the current development in Zimbabwe. What does it mean for the country? Do you think there might be a new beginning for Zimbabwe?
I'm very cautious about that. Military coups have not been known to produce much positive development. I think things might get worse before they get better. Zimbabweans have to look forward to the future and they have to resolve this situation. I hope there will be a peaceful transition.
Alex has chosen to remain cautious. Abel, your final comment. You have 30 seconds also.
I think the international community has to move in and make sure there's a plan by the military and the interim government to conduct elections next year. And I think it's going to be very useful if the Zimbabweans can realize that they don't need to elect all leaders. Guys who are above 60 years have to be shown the door so as to create space for new leadership in Zimbabwe. Yes. I'm not of the idea that the West has to be locked out in terms of sharing their views, because African leaders come from very bad backgrounds when it comes to democratic ideals. So the West is welcome to support, to make comments, and I think the international community has to move in and show direction to make sure, come 2018, there's an election in Zimbabwe.
Well said. Thank you very much, Abel Oyeyo. Abel is a researcher at the Center for African Progress. Joining us on phone was Alex Magaisa, former advisor to former Zimbabwean Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai, as well as Mark Bichachi, a political analyst. Thank you very much, all of you, for your input. And finally, on our Twitter poll, we did ask you earlier, do you support the Zimbabwe military action to seize power from Robert Mugabe? 85% of you said yes, and 15% of you said no. At Snooker T says, let this be a lesson to all those unpopular leaders clinging on to power. A big yes, and yes, however, it's something they should have done long time ago. Living 40 years in dictatorship is more of spending a life in a cemetery. I must say Zimbabweans have had more than enough of it. That is from Nancy Kondi. One final one. Tomdu Wardabedi says, why not? A country cannot be turned into a family enterprise. Many thanks for your feedback. And there's no way we're going to end the show without our proverb of the day. Take a look. Okay, away from that, to our bottom line tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, the world has been following events out of Zimbabwe with, I'm sure, a mixed bag of emotions. To say the least, Uncle Bob, the revolutionary son of Zimbabwe, whose credentials read like the biblical scroll for a man once knighted by the Queen of England and awarded a Chinese equivalent of a Nobel Peace Prize, and to his academic credentials, which are unmatched by any living president, and only recently was even considered by the World Health Organization as a goodwill ambassador for non-communicable diseases. Giving credit where it's due, Robert Mugabe deserves a lot more accolades. On the flip side, the same Mugabe epitomizes the very worst of infinite appetite for power, representing a generation that led Africa out of colonial subjugation to an era of governance controlled by oligarchs. The best symbolism to say was that Mugabe represents the era of the biblical Joshua, who led the faithful to Canaan only to shepherd them into Cold War era Siberia. Now, that Africa is not the kind of leadership this continent needs. Only recently, one of Africa's celebrated sons, Olusegun Obasanjo of Nigeria, said a former president himself gave some solid advice to his peers by saying, quote unquote, if you don't leave power, then power will leave you. And that is the bottom line tonight. Many thanks for watching. My name is Yusuf Ibrahim. Remember, this program is aired every Monday to Thursday from 10 to 11 p.m. Many thanks for watching. Bye-bye and enjoy the rest of the night.